I was thinking of doing a post about reading primary texts and setting myself a challenge to read a primary text every month, January through December 2018. You know, go right back to the beginning, pre-Socratics, and come right up to, you know, the 20th century. Perhaps has any primary text been written in the 21st century? That's a debate. Because I'm insufficient in my primary text reading. I have read some Plato, but no Aristotle. I have read Jewish scripture and Christian scripture, some of the Quran. I've read some Neoplatonists, but there is lots of important texts for that. You know, almost no Augustine, as much as I've read around him. I've read a lot of secondary texts and tertiary texts. But I was thinking about this, about, you know, should I set myself out, you know, should I read, do I need to read some Aristotle? Do I need to read some Augustine? You know, and then there's almost another 1,000 years in between that and those early Enlightenment philosophers, of which I've read bits of, you know, and then, you know, as more and more people write, there are more and more texts missing in my internal canon. But that was my kind of thought, and then I suddenly realised, you know, what? So then I think, why haven't I read, you know, properly read Descartes, properly read Kant? Well, I know I haven't read Kant because I've tried many times and I just don't understand it. But, you know, why haven't I read some of the kind of critical texts that have informed thinking? And I think it's because, having read lots of secondary texts, I now know, I mean, it must have been incredibly exciting to have read Descartes when it came out, because it offered a completely new way of thinking. Thinking about oneself, about the world, about, you know, reason and faith, and it proposed to be a solution, as lots of these texts did up until almost the mid-20th century. And if you think about Wittgenstein's Tractatus, he thought he'd answered all problems in philosophy. He went on to discover he hadn't, and then he wrote an even greater book, neither of which I've completed. But the point is we now know that if we're going to read Descartes now, or Kant now, or Hume now, and Hume is a huge absence in my reading. What are we reading? Are we reading just the history of philosophy? Are we reading it as part of a, or are we? Because I don't have the philosophical training to sort of grapple with it and then write something about it, which is a secondary text. So I'm just reading it as a historical document. And if I am, I'm essentially reading documents that have proved to be wrong. I mean, if you Descartes located the soul in the pineal gland at the back of the brain. Well, he's clearly not right there. You know, the interpretation of dreams, which is absolutely a primary text in the history of thought. Freud, you know, said a whole load of things that we now know to be borderline silly, more silly, I think, than Descartes locating the soul in the pineal gland. But anyway, and that's the case. So it's an odd endeavour to kind of go, you know. So I mean, if you go back to Plato's Republic, which I've read bits of, you know, I now know, obviously, that one of the central tenets of the Republic is that he was going to ban and exile poets and music. Well, that's what the Taliban did. It's, you know, and so it's a really odd So, you know, and anyone who wants to exile poets and musicians is plainly slightly mad, but obviously he's hugely important. Aristotle believed that slaves were inferior. So it's wrestling with sort of, it's trying to get into the mindset of texts that were written in their time, but knowing now that we've moved on from them. That's why reading secondary texts are actually more interesting, because they're putting them in context. They're telling you what is important, but sort of saying, you know, why thinking was, you know, sorry, there was a grey hair here. What, you know, and so do I want to wrestle with these texts and, you know, give up other things I want to read just to sort of go, yes, no, I have read, you know, Plato, I have read Aristotle, or, you know, more than I have. Or have I, in fact, read these philosophers in the secondary, almost tertiary texts that I've read? You know, it has, do I know enough now about, what was I thinking about? I was thinking about, sort of, so what, you know, absolutely critical text is Hegel's Introduction to a Philosophy of History, which I've read the introduction to the introduction, and obviously Das Kapital, Marx, central 19th century texts. Das Kapital is clear, you know, it's clearly, you know, it was brilliant and comprehensive until someone worked out, you know, that, or until someone had an economic theory post it, and it realised that his theory essentially would collapse in on itself. I can't remember what the theory was, but, you know, and it also has, you know, I have to ask myself, you know, am I going to be someone who feels that's important, or what is important that is that I have some sense of how these blocks go together, these writers go together in a narrative over those, you know, if we go back to the pre-Socratics and theology, you know, pre Judeo-Christianity, is that all I need to be for myself? Is someone who sort of can navigate from the beginning through to where we are without necessarily being someone who can talk about the kind of granular detail in these writers at my age? I mean, you know, so, and in the end I just basically thought, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to carry on what I'm doing, which is finding fantastic secondary texts that unpick the important bits in these philosophers that is relevant to these times, and continue that kind of intellectual journey, and essentially be an amateur, which is a kind of, you know, in a sense, a sort of lover of the history of thought, but not an academic who essentially has to go and do the first line reading. But that's it. Thank you very much.